Hello everybody. My name is Chris Fleischman, as mentioned. I just wanted to reiterate the fact that I would like you all to try and fill in that survey at the end, because that'll help us improve and it'll help me make sure I get the material better to you next time. Thank you. So here's my email address. It's pretty easy to remember, unfortunately. It's fchris@amazon.com. Feel free to email me questions if they're not answered today, or your local solutions architect. So the topics I wanted to talk about today are the SQL Server deployment options. Namely, there are two deployment options which you'll hear about today, one of which is our Relational Database Service offering, RDS, and the other one is our EC2, Elastic Cloud Compute offering, where you can deploy the SQL Server database onto. We'll also talk about the high availability options with SQL Server on AWS, the security and the migration to AWS options. I just wanted to also reiterate the fact that while AWS has many, many different products, today we're just talking about one circled there in the red, which is SQL Server, which is one database of many databases we support on AWS. So Microsoft SQL Server deployment options. There are two ways to deploy SQL Server on AWS. I mentioned them before, but this is just to recap. So one option, you'll note here, I'm talking about 2008 R2 and 2012. I'll talk to you in a minute about 2014. But 2008 R2 and 2012, they can be deployed to Relational Database Service, as I said before, which is Amazon RDS, or even shorter again is RDS, which is our managed database service. You can also deploy onto Elastic Cloud Compute or Amazon EC2 or EC2. I'll then probably try and shorten the names throughout. So RDS is Relational Database Service, EC2 is Elastic Cloud Compute, and I'll refer to those two acronyms. And of course, if you do want to deploy SQL Server 2014, you would need to deploy that currently onto EC2. We don't yet have that available in our RDS offering. I just wanted to reiterate, in case you're not aware, that Microsoft products or Microsoft workloads are fully supported on AWS. You'll see in this list many different products that have been highlighted, such as SharePoint, Link, Dynamics, etc. You'll also see Microsoft's RDS product being Remote Desktop Services. But I just wanted to re-highlight, or rather highlight the fact that you can log support issues to AWS, and we will in turn have back-to-back support with Microsoft. In that, if there is a problem, we will proxy, or rather, we will help you try and solve that problem with Microsoft. However, if AWS believes that, hey, we're just becoming the middle person getting stuck in the middle, and it's easier to refer you just directly to Microsoft, we'll pass you the case where we were working on that, and we'll just pass that directly to you, and you can start talking to Microsoft directly through that case. But once again, all products are supported on AWS. There are a couple of different flavors of how to get it onto AWS. Let me just see if I move this. And so one of the ways of which is what we announced a couple of weeks ago, which is dedicated hosts on AWS. Now this allows you, amongst many things, but it allows you to create your own EC2 instances on that dedicated host. And that dedicated instance allows you to do things, dedicated host allows you to slice up your own EC2 instances, but more importantly, allow you to bring your own licenses onto AWS. Think of it like a colo, in that you don't need to worry about software assurance, you don't need to worry about software mobility, and that you can bring those EC2 or those software products with your favorite ISV. You can tag particular virtual CPUs against an EC2 instance and meet all of the requirements typically of that ISV support or that license term. And of course you can get lots more granularity in terms of AWS config, so that you can pass to the auditors all that information that you might require, such as tagging how many virtual CPUs are allocated to a particular piece of software. You'll get these slides afterwards, but there is a dedicated host page which talks about the different products that you might want to have a look through. Now, when you move Microsoft products to AWS, typically you need Microsoft mobility, or rather license mobility. Now, when you move Microsoft products to AWS, you typically have to make sure that you have the license with Microsoft, but also the capability of moving it to a different platform. This would be the case if you were moving it to VMware, if you're moving it to other different cloud providers. So you need software assurance, software mobility, and this allows you to move it. Now, I did point out before that dedicated hosts, if you were to take out that program, you actually don't need the license mobility. One point of reference for you all, you'll see here that in 2014, Microsoft has actually started to change some of the terms sometimes. Now, this is just a recommendation. We're not Microsoft licensing people. But I urge everybody to look at their 2014 and beyond PUR agreements so that you don't have to pay for a passive node because 2012 and earlier you may not have had. And as of 2014, they started to introduce the capability of paying for the, or rather the need to pay for the passive node. Now, here's a couple of things. I just want to make sure that everyone's aware. We are not Microsoft licensing people. This is only guidance, and with that, you would obviously have to check with Microsoft themselves. Once again, the caveat is this is what we believe the licensing is on AWS, but I urge you to check with Microsoft. So there's effectively two different flavors, one of which is on EC2 and the other one which is our relational data as service offering. So this is the page for EC2. You'll see here that if you are bringing your own license or license included for an EC2 instance, so that's just your typical on-demand instances and things like that, you'll see firstly that you need to license by the virtual CPU. So when you look at our EC2 product family, you'll see that all of those instances have the amount of virtual CPUs that are available to you. Now, in that particular case, you need to license all mirrors. So in other words, if you typically did log shipping between an active instance and a non-active, like a passive instance or a secondary, in your old data centers and things, assuming that you haven't paid for that new 2014 change, you would only pay for the active, whereas on AWS EC2, you would need to pay for both the mirrors and the active. Then we've got dedicated instances and now dedicated hosts. In this particular case, you can bring your own license, BYOL. Again, you'll notice that it's licensed by virtual CPU. Again, you'll notice that you need a minimum of 4. But here, you don't actually need to pay for the mirrors, which by far you'll see is the cheapest option out of all of these three. And lastly, you'll see that EC2 dedicated instances with license included, you'll see here that it's the same almost as on demand in that you do need to pay for all mirrors. And again, email me at fchris@amazon.com or feel free to ask the panel and we can ask that later, or your local solutions architect to help you with some of those intricacies. Now with RDS, unfortunately or fortunately, it's a bit more simple in that regardless of whether you bring your own license. Now in RDS's case, if you bring your own license, you do need to meet the license mobility question. So we will ask you to provide license mobility, and you would need to fill in a form to make sure that you adhere to that. If you use our licensing, which is RDS ships with standard edition licensing, then you would still, we would cover the licensing cost, but you're paying for all mirrors as well. So the cheapest option out of EC2 and RDS, if you just want to look at raw cost, is EC2, where you're doing dedicated instances or dedicated hosts with bringing your own license, assuming you haven't signed up for that new PER under 2014. Hopefully that's clear. I know there's lots of different variations there. Now, some of the things that we offer now, you'll see here that for SQL Server 2008 R2 and 2012, you'll see here that we support all of those products under license included. you'll see there the little note against Enterprise Edition, in that we don't do license included outside of those 3 regions down below, which is Virginia, Oregon, and Dublin. I know people in Sydney have asked for this, and I would ask those people that are in Sydney, Singapore, and Tokyo, and when we announce our new region in India, you can raise those questions with your local SA. However, bringing your own license, you can of course bring your Standard Edition and Enterprise Edition licenses, but once again you do need to meet that software assurance and license mobility, with the caveat that you don't need to do that for dedicated hosts. You can just co-load your license. Now, the reasons that people look at RDS, there's quite a few, but some of those are the installation. Now, I like to call this the, the administration, the system administration of a database is what RDS is all about. For example, if you were to install an Oracle database, you would need to install all the patches, you need to install, the products, you need to then configure it all correctly and make it all work. Well, we take care of that for you with the installation. 2 common problems with databases is, hey, the machine doesn't have enough grunt, in other words, doesn't have enough CPU or doesn't have enough RAM. Well, when we turn on multi-AZ support, which we'll get to in a little bit later, you can effectively change the scaling of the hard drive, the EBS volume that it runs on. You can change that while still active. And how that works is it applies the scaling of the storage to the secondary in the offline instance. You don't have access to the offline instance. We do this for you. We change that database configuration. We change the size of the EBS volume, and then we switch that back, switch the DNS service over to the secondary when that's now operational, and then we do it for the master, the original master, and then you have the new size of storage. For a small interruption currently, you can change the EC2 instance size from something that's smaller to something that's larger if you so choose. We also offer with RDS the capability of doing minor patch updates. Say for example there's a new vulnerability, like a new security patch. We can typically do that in place for you, and you won't have to worry about any downtime. We also give you a maintenance window such that if you do want to make offline changes to that database, you could, for example, specify at 12 a.m. At night, and then maintenance window might be 4 hours, and you can do all of that work during that 4-hour period. We will also, I think it's our CTO that says a data center can be in any 2 states. One state is that the data center is dying, or the other state is that it's dead. And so if you program and you create an application architecture that's aware of that, your application will outlive any one node failure. And that's the case with RDS, in that if an instance fails, it'll switch over to the secondary. The primary instance will then get replaced under the covers. We will then spin it up, get all the data across to it and all that sort of stuff, and then add it back into that multi-AZ solution for you. Backing up and recovery, that's a fantastic little tool there where you can do a snapshot of the RDS database. Now that might be every 24 hours, and you can simply run one command line to restore and create a new database, very simply and very good, and sometimes people use that for cloning the database for multiple environments. And lastly, what RDS gives you is the multi-AZ capability, which means that you're writing to a master effectively, and we take care of block level synchronization to a secondary. In that if there is a failure, it'll fail over or fail back to the instance. And of course, the other side is you can deploy SQL Server on your own EC2 instance, and of course you have full control of that instance. When it comes to RDS, it's a black box, if you will. We take away the system privileges, so you don't have system DBA privileges. You also don't have access to the underlying file system. So for example, if a customer was to say, hey, I need to install an agent that's not yet supported on our RDS service, then we would ask you to look at EC2 instances at this point in time. Of course, we're busily adding more and more extensions and adding more and more features to RDS, so we'd ask you to continue to look at those products, but for that particular point in time, if that extension is not available, you can't yet install it. But however, on the side of EC2, You have an EC2 instance, you can patch the operating system, you can patch all of the system level things, you can tune particular variables and things that you didn't have access to in RDS. And of course you have full configuration on that Microsoft SQL Server database. So very simply, when you look at this presentation later or offline, these are the reasons, or these are the time zones that we support. These are the features and functions that we support. One of which I'll call out is the target for SSRS and target for SSIS. This simply means you can't install those particular products or those components on RDS at this point in time. So it means that you would need to treat RDS as a target for an EC2 instance to remote call to RDS. However, you'll see on the next page, which is the unsupported features, a couple that I'll point out is we don't yet support more than 30 databases per instance. So for example, those people that are very highly virtualized, where they might have 100 databases running on a single instance, we would say, well, you'd have to probably do that on an EC2 instance. Another one that you'll see there is an asterisk next to the Windows authentication. Now, things like SharePoint, where it requires Windows Auth, unfortunately RDS at this point in time doesn't work with that. But if you talk to your local solution tech, they might be able to tell you a little bit more information under NDA about when that might be supported. Other products you'll see there on the right-hand side are things like the SSAS, SSIS, SSRS. You'll see that we are adding those over time, but right now they're not yet supported. So if you look at this list, and it is a feature that you probably need in your solution, you probably at this point in time means that you have to roll your own on EC2. Now talking about the high availability options on SQL Server on AWS. So a couple of options really, one of which is RDS offers multi-AZ support. Now unfortunately we don't support RDS SQL Server multi-AZ in regions which have 2 or less availability zones. Now, just for those people that might know what this is, but I'll assume that you can look it up afterwards if you don't, we have what's called a split brain scenario, or rather we are a pessimistic bunch and we make sure that we protect ourselves from these scenarios. And so what might happen if you've got 2 physical data centers is that if you cut the fiber between the 2 data centers, and both nodes come back online at the same time, they will try and demote each other and effectively take your database offline. Now, and how that plays out in AWS is we have 2 availability zones. Again, they're separated by physical fiber. Now, if an availability zone was to go offline because it was severed between the 2, again, when the RDS instance comes back online, it says, well, hey, I'm the master, and the other one says, hey, I'm the master. So we have a very minute chance of that ever happening, but because it can happen, we need that 3rd availability zone. Now, for the people that live in the Asia-Pacific region, which is probably most of you, I urge you to talk to your local solutions architect about when that solution might come to your region. Now, because of that, we don't yet support, for example, I've listed here below, we don't yet support SQL Server multi-AZ mode in Sydney, in the Sydney region. Nor do we support it in Singapore. So if you do need multi-AZ support, what other customers have done is roll their own, which is the SQL Server on AWS EC2. And they've installed their own witness server in effectively a competitor's cloud environment, or maybe they've got a direct connection into AWS and they run their witness server back on site on their own data center. And that witness server literally just needs a heartbeat to say, are you alive, and it makes the decision. So if you look at this white paper, which you can see when you download this presentation later, it'll talk through those different options and talk about using Microsoft's always-on technology for availability. Now, in the case of RDS, we obviously do this for you. Now, in the case of EC2, you would need to manage these scenarios yourself. So with the case of RDS, what we say is if the availability zone A or B go offline, then the alternate availability zone can obviously be the backup for that. So it'll switch over with the DNS failover. We ask you to use the CNAME reference for that DNS entry. such that you're talking to a CNAME reference for RDS, and if the primary availability zone goes offline, it'll fail over to the secondary. And of course, if you lose access to the database, again, we will make sure that we will fail over to the secondary. And of course, if a data center is failing or if a compute node is failing, we will try and recover that compute node. If we can't recover that, we will create a new one, but in that case, we'll also fail over to the other alternate side. Lastly, of course, is if our storage fails, again, we'll fail over to the secondary. Now, what we won't do are the application side of things. For example, if you have a long-running query and you perceive that RDS is failing, well, we won't know. We can't know because it's an application query and we don't have any insights into your application performance. You will need to monitor and look at that. So in that case, you would have to run a long-running query, and if that is not working, you would have to have some sort of interceptor pattern to say, hey, this is not working, what can I do to remedy that? We won't be able to support or fail over from there. Now, here are the scenarios where RDS, which is a relational database service, and RDS MAZ, which is multi-AZ support. You'll see here that we support region failure for RDS and for RDS multi-AZ. You'll see, however, that we don't support AZ failure for RDS without multi-AZ. So in this particular case, what that means for yourself for SQL Server, if you were to use the Sydney region, for example, and if the availability zone, which is where you have deployed SQL Server to, because remember we don't have multi-AZ support yet, you would have that service interruption while we recover the AZ. However, it will try and recover the instances. There would be a disruption, however, because the instance obviously is offline while we try to recover it, and similarly with storage. You'll see here, however, though, that the recovery time is actually not too bad. You'll see here that RDS to recover takes roughly 5 minutes, and I'll get into this in a little bit more detail. You'll see here for RDS multi-AZ, however, that it's 60 seconds for those scenarios. Now, what we mean by those scenarios is it's the CNAME DNS failover from the primary to the master. It takes roughly about 60 seconds to do the fail from the primary to the secondary. In the case of RDS, where we've listed there 5 minutes, what happens actually in that time is that a new instance is created. The EBS volume which had your data on it would be recovered from a snapshot. Then we actually have a bunch of logs to capture or to catch back up to where we were in terms of those, in terms of where your data has changed since that last known snapshot, and we put all of those files in a private bucket within S3. So the absolute best case that you have there is 5 minute loss of data. But after the worst pessimistic option is that in the case of all things being evil, you might be writing, or rather the system might be writing a file to S3, and in that process of writing, it fails the write. So what we mean by 5 minutes and then plus is it hasn't happened yet in the sort of the years since we've run RDS, but in the case where there is a sever between the RDS writing the log and S3 failing or something like that, you would lose that last 5 minutes. So potentially you'd be 10 minutes behind that solution, but you wouldn't be further than 10 minutes. Now, security. So one of the things that I can't recommend highly enough is that you need to install the database, because people do this. Don't install the database in a public subnet. That's not the best idea. Try and install it in a private subnet when you create the security groups and you create the subnet groups. Please don't put them in a public subnet. Our services team, just by a little bit of a black belt tip, is we actually run some server-side things to make sure that customers aren't doing that. And if we do find that there's a instance out there in the World Wide Web that's on a public subnet, we will send an email to that AWS user saying, are you aware that this is on the public, this is public facing? Is that something that you want to do? So once again, in the days of where Classic and VPC were part of AWS, we urge everybody to obviously use a virtual private cloud. And we urge everybody to create a private subnet for putting their database in. We ask you to create a security group and use the database with a known security group just for the database. And potentially here, the reason why we might do that is you might have an application subnet group, and that application subnet group might be the source for the security group. And so the only way to talk to that database, for example, is to come via the application group. So you can sort of create that nested security mapping such that it should come through the known locations of where you're expecting. And again, lots of software out there, for example, some free and open source database tools or some free and open source performance testing tools try and discover the IP address of particular things. Now, in that particular case, imagine an EC2 instance that was to fail, which we don't know when or how often that occurs. Of course, we don't want that to happen. But if it does and you're using the IP address, well, what's going to happen? Your software will fail. So we ask you to use the CNAME reference in front of RDS so that if it files over to the secondary or is still working with the primary, that everything is okay. Lastly, we ask you to always move data across or move data around when things are traveling backwards and forwards within the VPC or to the VPC from outside in the internet, is always use SSL where possible, TLS. Here, we would even push you further to say you should probably encrypt your data before it even arrives onto AWS if you're worried about the data in transit. Now, one of the things that all of those aforementioned RDS commands, like changing the hard drive size, changing the size of the EC2 configuration, doing backups, doing recovery, are all done through our identity and access management solution. So in other words, you can create a role where that role is allowed to do those certain activities. Of course, that's all auditable, so you can look at CloudTrail and make sure that that's something that is correct, and you can tie users to those roles. And of course, the last thing you want to do is pass around those roles to everybody so that everyone can make backups to your database. That's probably not the best idea. And you want to obviously create the minimum amount of privileges. For example, one common task is for doing a snapshot, and that might be a nightly snapshot of RDS. Well, you want to only allow that one role to do that snapshot. You might not allow that role to also create EC2 instances. You might not allow that role to do things with Redshift. You just want to make very specific rules and create those roles with those specific permissions. And of course, you don't want just to allocate one role to one user. And in this particular case, sometimes people say, well, that's a good idea because I then know who the user is. But what happens if that user was to quit? And sometimes, depending on privileges and how that's set up, that causes a bit of a problem in terms of administration. So we typically would say we'll use some sort of mail list or mail alias so that there's more than one person that has control of that. Visibility is very important inside of AWS, so make sure that when you create RDS instances or you're creating EC2 instances that you tag those resources, perhaps with, I'm in this VPC, project number 1, this is for application number 1, and so I'm going to tag it that way. And that also helps with billing and things like that at the end of the month when you want to know who to charge where. And of course, you don't want to create credentials and then 3 years later find out that that person has left and is still logging into the environment. So try and rotate your certificates, rotate the roles, rotate the people that are invited to those roles. Change them maybe every 3 months. Now, we recommend that you put secure at rest, except for, if it's a dev workload that you don't necessarily care about what the data is. But outside of that, we have a couple of options that you might want to think about. So, for example, RDS by default can work with our Amazon Knowledge, certificate management service. In other words, you can pass us your private certificate, and then it can encrypt all of the data that's sitting inside of RDS, and you can use that data which is encrypted to you because you are the only ones that have that certificate. Of course, we support for RDS SQL Server and also for RDS Oracle. You can do the transparent data encryption, the TDE. With Enterprise Edition of SQL Server, you can use column level encryption. And lastly, if your data is super sensitive, then you probably should be tokenizing it before it comes onto a cloud-based solution. So tokenize your content, encrypt it before it even lands on RDS. So you can do effectively 2 or 3 steps of encryption, and it'll be pretty hard to break. And again, we mentioned this before, but these are the security options that I ask you to look through, one of which are the network controls. Make sure that the virtual private cloud, make sure that the subnets, make sure that the security groups are all defined with the least privilege. So in other words, I can't do something unless I have granted that privilege in the known configuration that I've set up, the DB security group, the application security group, the DB subnets that I've created, and of course the virtual private cloud. You can define roles, again, as to who can actually run what administration task against RDS. And there were different options that we talked about before in terms of securing the data when it's at rest in the database. And when in transit, all of the endpoints within AWS, as you may or may not be aware, but all of those endpoints are HTTPS, so they're all secure using common certificate functionality, TLS. Lastly, I wanted to talk to you about the migration service. So at reInvent, we announced the AWS migration service. Right now, you can actually whitelist yourselves for a tool, which is a prelude to the actual announcement of the data migration service. And the data migration service, very simply put, allows you to talk to a source database and point it to a target database. And it does it very simply in that you can launch through the console, and this is where the product is going. You can launch through the console as a service offering and point on the left-hand side. Imagine that being the target, and the source. And that source could be a number of 4 different variations of product at the moment: SQL Server, Oracle, Postgres, SQL Server, Postgres, Oracle, and MySQL. At the right-hand side, you can actually point to a few other databases. But one of the common scenarios that we actually heard about, and this I find is quite interesting, is the ability to point to a source database, point to a target database being something on AWS, such as a development environment, and then leave it running for the next 5 years, for example. Hey, I'm not going to turn off my production database on-premise, so I'm going to leave it running on, I'm going to leave it running and create a development environment and make sure that that catches up, which is pretty cool. Now, one thing that you can do, or rather one thing that you're not allowed to do, is you can't use this tool to point a source and target database being on-premise. In other words, the data has to leave your premise and come to AWS, or leave AWS and back to on-premise. It just can't be used through licensing problems or licensing terms from on-premise to on-premise. And of course, one of the cool things that I like about this product is, imagine having a database, and let's say it's made up of 100 tables, and just for easy numbers, 30 of those tables are, need the Enterprise Edition features of SQL Server. So you can point this tool to the Enterprise features of SQL Server on the left-hand side, and because it needs all of those features, you can make the decision that you need a SQL Server on the right-hand side running in AWS. So you can point the tool to the left-hand side, target those particular tables, and then on the right-hand side, move them across to the other side of the database. Now, it's important to note that it moves the data. It doesn't change the schema, which I'll get into in a minute. And so basically, you need to create the database on the right-hand side, lift the data from the left-hand side, and push it over to AWS, either running on EC2 or running within RDS. So imagine moving those 30 tables into SQL Server on the right-hand side. But another 30 of those tables, you might want to do reporting. So imagine being able to throw those into Amazon Redshift and doing some analytics on that, and running up those very fast queries of very large tables, for example. Maybe some of the other options are that, hey, the last 30 are pretty simple things, so we don't really need to pay for an Enterprise Edition product because we want to scale that out. So you could push those tables, for example, into MariaDB as an example of a non-proprietary database. So to have a look at these tools, I urge you to look at this URL here, aws.amazon.com/DMS. And when I'm looking at, there's 2 particular tools. I've talked about the migration service. There's another one called the DB Schema service. Now, the DB Schema will be a tool, more than likely, that you can download and run on your desktop. And what it'll do is it'll point to your source database, and it will try in its best to convert what are your stored procedures of Oracle and SQL Server at this point in time, and a target are all of those listed above on this screen here, the Postgres, the Oracle, etc. And it allows you to try and do a deep inspection of all those stored procedures and try and convert them to one of those new database types. So let's say, for example, you had a SQL Server database on the left-hand side and you had all of these fancy stored procedures. Well, this tool will try and convert all of those stored procedures as best as they can into the target database, which could be homogeneous. You could be doing it on the same database, but more importantly, obviously, on a heterogeneous database where you're doing it to a new tool, a new target. So this helps customers, for example, move off an existing database onto a new database. Very simply put, it doesn't require agents. So the way it works is you need higher privileges typically for your logs. It effectively uses your redo logs on the database on the left-hand side, and it'll push through no agent install onto the right-hand side. So you'll see here that it creates a service which will be hopefully published soon, but you can get access to a tool at the moment, which is a preview of all of these services. The tool doesn't have all of the high availability and redundancy built in. This service will. But the tool allows you to point to the source database, pull off that information using the logs and all those sorts of things, and push it across to AWS as these steps will show here. So again, database migration service points to the source, points to the target, no agents installed. You start up a replication instance being on the right-hand side. You point it to the database on the left-hand side. It'll catch up over time, and then it'll effectively connect and select the table, select the schemas, and move the content across. It'll then run. Now, when the service is available and generically available to everybody, generally available, it'll allow you to make sure that if it fails, it'll recover and take off where it left. It'll keep them in sync. It'll move content to and from. And of course, it'll allow you to, one scenario is you can turn off the existing database because you now have it on AWS. More so, other scenarios are that you might have both running for the rest of time until you're ready that you don't need that customer data center anymore. And again, we are currently looking at all of these flavors of different databases as targets. Obviously, we don't have Aurora, we don't have things like Amazon Redshift on-premise, so these are the targets. But we are looking at doing things like talk to DynamoDB as a target, talk to Kinesis as a target, maybe put it into Memcache as a different target. So we're looking at adding, obviously, more targets to our database, and obviously we're also looking at adding more sources to our, where we can lift content from. Now, one of the common questions, and I'll just throw it out there so people can ask those questions or ask me later, but some customers run IBM DB2. That's not currently listed in our roadmap, but if you do have that question, I would ask you to talk to your local solutions architect, who will hopefully help you direct those questions and help you with the roadmap conversation. And of course, to get access to the schema conversion tool, it's free. You can download it. You can just go to that aws.amazon.com/DMS and download that schema tool. I always find, when customers ask me, hey, what effort would be required to move from the source database to a target database? And I would say, well, how long is a piece of string? Now, you could actually use the DB schema tool to point to the source database, get the report which sort of says, hey, I was able to move this content. The next category will be, hey, I've changed these stored procedures, but do you like them? And the third one will be, hey, I was not able to move these stored procedures. So imagine now having that report that you could take to your business owner and say, hey, this is actually a little bit more effort. It's not the magic bullet that we all hope for, but it's done some of it. It might have done 30%, for example. And I'd also ask you to sign up and have a look at that migration tool. Imagine using it for a homogeneous where you just need to create a replica of your current database without any downtime, or you want to actually move it to a different target database, which I think is a lot more interesting. A very common use case out there at the moment is the ability to take content off a database, a relational database, and push it into Redshift to do some pretty fancy analytics on. And I would ask you to look through, this week has obviously got many different topics as highlighted. but there's many other online courses and material. Of course, we have instructor-led training, instructor-led classes. And lastly, we actually have certifications. I know in Australia, when I'm traveling around and recently in Singapore, that our customers are starting to ask us for people to be certified. So I'd have a look at that and make sure that you're getting your skills up if that's something of interest. And lastly, we know we said this before, but these slides will be available on that URL below, which you'll have access to, slideshare.net/Amazon Web Services. Please do use the Twitter feed, email marketing if there's something that you're not sure about, and of course, run through that survey. Tell me what things I need to improve on, of course, and if you've enjoyed my survey, fill it in appropriately so that we can all do better next time. Otherwise, any questions, and I'll just bring it up for some popular questions before we wrap up. So there's one question here. It says, once in a year I need to retry my data. So in a scenario I want to store massive data in a Glacier without S3 bucket or other services, is there any possibilities in how I connect to it from on-premise? So the conversation we'll suggest is you would store that information maybe in the S3, infrequent S3 access, or maybe in Glacier. And you would basically, store a snapshot of all of your data. Maybe it's an RDS snapshot where your database is running, and you can not have to run that. You can just basically create a snapshot and then come back to that later if you so choose. And there's a couple of people that are saying if they want to choose a different standard. Now, at this point in time, you can't actually change the localization. So at the moment we don't support lots of different local time zone supports, and sometimes we don't support some local different languages. So if you're experiencing those problems, I would ask that you talk to your solutions architect. Right now on the roadmap we have more time zone support, but currently we don't have all time zones that you might be expecting. But I would again ask that you either log a support call or talk to your local solutions architect for some of that information. So right now with SQL Server RDS, there is no option for always on. At the moment we use our own secret source, which is effectively synchronized replication. We don't yet support always on for SQL Server. Of course you can do that with your own EC2 instance. Now another customer has asked, hey, I want to move all of my SQL data onto Amazon. What's the best way? Depends on how large the data is, and depends on if the data is in a back file or those sorts of things, but let's assume that it's running inside of a production database. You can actually pull that content using the DMS service and again push it onto an AWS instance and run it that way. And you can do that live while not impacting necessarily your production instance if that was where it was sitting. Once it is moved, once you're happy with the database running inside of AWS, maybe the option is to turn off that existing database. Now, currently, there's another question here related to Oracle, but does the DMS service work with earlier versions of Oracle? Yes, it does, but it may not support the CDC mode. So what I mean by that is change data capture with version 9. It will support, for example, a snapshot, a bulk injection, but it won't necessarily do the change data capture. So again, maybe your best bet there is to talk to a local solutions architect from AWS, and they might be able to point you to a user guide, and that user guide will go through some of those steps about what features and functions are supported within that tool. Now currently the upper limit size in terms of the database itself, for SQL Server RDS it's 4 terabytes. For Postgres, Oracle and MySQL it's 6 terabytes of database size. If you were to roll your own EC2 instance, it would be up to 16 terabytes because that's our largest EBS volume at this point in time. Other people have said, can I change the SQL correlation status in AWS RDS instance? I would suggest that you ask that question through support or through our local solutions architect to actually get to the bottom of that. I'm not sure we'll have enough time to discuss that on this at this juncture. Now, other customers, for example, are saying, how do I access Glacier using third-party tools? That's a bit of a different topic, but just very quickly, Glacier stores things as effectively an encrypted file. As long as you know what is effectively the unique ID of that file, you can use any third-party tool because we provide an API into Glacier that you could execute against. Now, currently, are you able to shift RDS? So I'm not exactly sure if this is making sense, but currently our RDS is a database service, and so it's not a presentation service. So that's Microsoft Remote Desktop Service, I think you might be talking about there. If it's RDS and you're talking about something Citrix related, I ask you to maybe talk to your solutions architect and discover what that question really is about. Right now, as I said before, if you have multi-AZ support, which we don't yet have in Australia, and in regions that require 3 or more availability zones for SQL Server, you can extend the volume size, but there would be a disruption to your service. And again, you can scale the storage up to those limits that I just mentioned before for RDS. If you are running on EC2, you would have to effectively create a new EBS volume, or rather restore, create a snapshot of the EBS volume which is running your data, and reattach or create a new EBS volume with a larger size and do it that way. Just quickly, sorry. If you have auto-scaling and EC2 reaches the limit of creating instances, I think that's again a different topic, but AWS, when you first create an account, you get soft limits for AWS services, and those soft limits are there to prevent, some silly things as well as making sure that you're using services in the correct manner. So what I would do there is log a support call, and that support call would have something like, I need to increase the limits because of whatever the problem is you're trying to solve. So if you're hitting a limit with auto-scaling because you've run out of EC2 instances, in terms of your soft limit, I would ask your local solutions architect representative to help you there. So when you're installing the configuration, again, there's a couple of questions people are asking about time zones and different support. Again, we don't necessarily have all the time zones supported, so I'd ask you to have a look through those time zones that we do support, which is in our user guide for RDS. If there is a feature that you do or are missing, I would ask you to talk to the local solutions architect who will be able to, one, point out if there's something that they know about that's coming, or two, take on your request because, hey, if you're asking a request that's not there, maybe some other customers are, and maybe AWS needs to know about that so that we can add that as a feature request for a later date. And I think that's it for the questions, unless there's nothing else coming through. So there's one more here, which I'll get to, which is customers are asking for if I'm using an EC2 SQL Server solution, so I'm going to roll my own master and slave. You can roll your own HA proxy. It again would be on your own EC2 instance. You can do that. You can configure your own load balancing solution in front of your own EC2 instance. You can configure it any which way you like, and lots of customers have chosen to do that. But what I mean, and I'll be a little bit more pedantic about it, let's say you have physically 2 different data centers. That's what we mean by multi-AZ, which is you need 3 physical data centers for true availability. And happy to have that conversation offline, but effectively imagine one data center going offline regardless of whether you had 50 nodes in one building and in one data center and 50 nodes in the other data center. There is still that scenario where you can cut the sever between the 2 data centers. Now in that particular case, that split brain can still occur. So really what we're saying we need 3 availability zones is to make sure that if that sever was between 2 availability zones, that we still have an operational one that says, actually I know what was happening. So again, you can roll your own EC2 instance, you can use your own HA proxy, you can configure always on to make sure that you have the most available solution that's possible. But that won't necessarily prevent you from the split brain scenario unless you have a witness server outside of those 2 availability zones. Is the DB creator role supported in RDS? I believe the answer is no there. It's a system DBA type privilege. We don't give access to the system DBA privilege, and we don't give access to the file system. I think that's it for questions, so we might finish there.